Keanu Reeves sat at his dining table, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands, the morning light spilling through the large windows behind him. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through emails without much interest. Film schedules, charity invitations, a few fan letters. One subject line caught his attention. Exclusive invitation, a candid conversation on the Melissa Carter Show. He raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of his coffee as he opened it. Melissa Carter, famous for her sharp interviews and even sharper opinions. She was known for grilling Hollywood celebrities, especially those with traditional or old-school views. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his calm expression giving nothing away. He wasn't naive. He knew how these interviews worked. Trap questions, carefully edited sound bites, a host itching for a viral moment. For a second, he considered declining, but then he typed out a simple reply, "I'd be honored." Somewhere across town, Melissa Carter was already planning her next move. In the brightly lit studio, her producer, Jake, tossed a handful of note cards onto the table. He actually agreed. Jake looked almost amused. Melissa smirked, adjusting her perfectly styled hair in the mirror. Of course he did. He's too nice to say no. That's exactly why it's going to work. People think he's untouchable, but I'm about to show them the real Keanu Reeves. Jake nodded slowly, knowing that when Melissa had her mind set on something, nothing could change it. You really think he's an easy target? Trust me, Melissa replied confidently. The world needs to move on from his outdated good guy charm. We're going to expose the hypocrisy behind the humble hero act. The morning of the interview arrived and Keanu pulled up to the studio on his black motorcycle, helmet under his arm. A few crew members gave him cautious nods, some whispering to each other. Keanu didn't pay much attention. As he made his way inside, a security guard couldn't help but smile. "Big fan, Mr. Reeves," the guard said. Keanu gave him a small nod, his voice soft. "Thanks, man." Inside the studio, the atmosphere was buzzing. Cameras were being adjusted, lights calibrated to perfection. Melissa sat at her desk, rehearsing her lines, while the audience settled into their seats. Some fans, some skeptics, and a few strategically planted critics. Keanu walked in, his presence effortlessly calm, and took his seat opposite Melissa. As the countdown began, Melissa flashed her trademark charming smile, but behind her eyes was a sharpness that wasn't easily masked. The camera light blinked red, signaling they were live. "Welcome to the Melissa Carter Show," she began smoothly. "Today, we have with us one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, Keanu Reeves. Keanu, thank you so much for being here." Keanu gave a small nod, his tone as humble as always. "Pleasure's mine." Melissa leaned forward, giving him a calculated smile. "You know, people adore you for your kindness and down-to-earth attitude. But let's be honest, does that really fit in with today's Hollywood? The industry's changing, don't you think? The era of the humble hero seems a bit outdated." Keanu met her gaze with the same calm look, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "I guess that depends on what values we're moving toward," he replied quietly. Melissa chuckled, but there was a hint of frustration in her eyes. "But don't you think that kind of image, strong, silent, almost too good to be true, feels a little fake? Like it's just part of the Hollywood script?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her words without a hint of defensiveness. "If being decent is outdated, then I guess I'm okay with being old-fashioned," he replied, his voice steady. The audience shifted, a few murmurs echoing through the studio. Melissa hesitated, caught off guard by how effortlessly he flipped her question. She couldn't afford to lose control now. Straightening up, she gave him a tight smile, ready to push harder. Melissa forced a light laugh, trying to regain her composure. She flipped through her cue cards, her smile tightening. She needed to strike harder, catch him off guard. "You know, Keanu," she began, her tone sharper now. "A lot of people admire your calm, quiet nature. But some say it's just a facade to maintain your good guy image. Isn't it possible that this whole humble act is just another way to stay relevant in an industry that's moving on from outdated heroes?" Keanu didn't flinch, his eyes steady and thoughtful. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Staying relevant? That's an interesting thought," he replied. "But I've never really chased relevance. I just try to be myself, whether that fits or not." Melissa arched a brow, sensing an opportunity. "But don't you think it's irresponsible, portraying violence as the answer to every problem? Your iconic roles, Neo, John Wick, are seen as glorifying aggression. Don't you think that's toxic masculinity wrapped up as heroism?" A faint murmur rippled through the audience, some nodding, others clearly uncomfortable with the way she framed the question. Keanu took a deep breath, never breaking eye contact. "I think stories are reflections of human struggle," he said gently. "Sometimes they're messy, painful, violent even. But they're not about glorifying pain. They're about surviving it, fighting to protect what you love, standing against what's wrong. Isn't that what real strength means?" Melissa felt a twinge of irritation and tried to mask it with a forced chuckle. "But don't you see how dangerous that message can be? Teaching young men that violence equals strength?" Keanu paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think strength is knowing when not to fight. It's defending those who can't defend themselves, not using power to dominate. Maybe the real problem is when we forget that courage and kindness can coexist." The audience seemed to lean in, caught between Melissa's pointed questions and Keanu's calm, unwavering responses. Melissa glanced at the producers behind the cameras. Some looked uneasy, sensing that the narrative wasn't going as planned. With a tight smile, she pushed again. "But don't you think Hollywood needs to evolve? Maybe it's time to move away from the typical, strong, silent hero and make way for more diverse, nuanced characters who don't always resort to violence." Keanu gave a slow nod, showing he understood her point. "I agree that stories need to evolve," he said, "but that doesn't mean abandoning the core values that define us. Honor, loyalty, courage. The world changes, but what makes us human stays the same. Isn't that why people still connect with those stories?" Melissa's smile faltered, and for the first time her confidence seemed to waver. She hadn't expected him to handle her questions with such grace. The audience was clearly on his side, and it was slipping out of her control faster than she could manage. She leaned back, determined to take a different approach. "Okay, let's be honest here," she said with a hint of exasperation. "Do you really think you still have a place in modern Hollywood? The industry is moving on from the old school action hero. Maybe it's time to step aside and let new voices take the lead." Keanu's expression remained calm, his eyes softening with empathy rather than irritation. "I never saw myself as a voice of any era," he replied. "I just play characters who reflect what people feel. Loss, resilience, love. Maybe it's not about stepping aside. Maybe it's about making room for everyone without discarding the past that shaped us." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Melissa couldn't hide her frustration, and the producers behind the scenes exchanged anxious glances. Keanu wasn't just defending himself. He was turning every question into a lesson on humanity, and it was making her look desperate. The camera zoomed in on Keanu's face, still calm, still unbothered. It was becoming clear that Melissa's strategy was failing. The audience could feel it too. Melissa could feel the tension building, and it wasn't working in her favor. She needed something sharper, something that would break through his calm demeanor. Flipping through her cue cards, she settled on a new angle. "You know, she began, leaning forward with a smirk. Some people think you're just too good to be true. It's like this whole humble, gentle act is just that. An act. Isn't it possible that people only see what you want them to see? Keanu gave a small shrug, his voice unshaken. Maybe, he admitted, but I've never tried to be anything I'm not. I don't have to prove anything. People believe what they want to believe. Melissa raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting him to stay so composed. But doesn't it bother you when people call you outdated? Hollywood's shifting towards more complex, flawed characters. People who reflect modern struggles. Your characters, John Wick, Neo, they're seen as stoic, almost emotionally detached. Isn't that a problem? Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile. Complex doesn't mean broken. Sometimes quiet strength says more than 1,000 words. Pain doesn't always need to be loud to be real. A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. Melissa's jaw tightened, but she quickly masked it with another forced smile. So, you're saying stoicism is the ultimate strength? Keanu shook his head gently. I'm saying resilience is strength. Stoicism isn't about suppressing pain. It's about carrying it without letting it break you. A few people in the audience nodded, clearly moved by his words. Melissa's grip tightened on her cue cards. She was losing them, losing control of the narrative. She couldn't afford that. Taking a sharp breath, she tried one last push. But don't you think that sends a dangerous message to young men? That showing vulnerability is a weakness? Keanu's gaze softened, his voice carrying a calm wisdom that silenced the room. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's honesty. But there's a difference between being vulnerable and being reckless. Strength comes from knowing who you are, facing your fears without giving them control. Melissa couldn't mask her irritation anymore. She was visibly flustered, and the audience could see it. Keanu wasn't playing into her game. He wasn't defensive or hostile. Instead, he was making every answer sound wise and thoughtful, turning the interview into a life lesson rather than a confrontation. Trying to change the mood, Melissa forced a laugh, though it sounded strained. Well, it's clear you have a lot of deep thoughts about this. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Your movies are notoriously violent. Don't you think that kind of content is harmful, especially considering how impressionable young people are? Keanu paused for a moment, his gaze dropping as if considering her words carefully. Then he looked up, his expression thoughtful yet resolute. Stories are reflections of our struggles. Violence in films isn't about celebrating harm. It's about portraying battles we fight within ourselves. Sometimes it's loss, sometimes it's redemption. It's not the violence that defines the story, it's why it's there. Melissa looked taken aback, clearly not prepared for such a composed response. Before she could interrupt, Keanu continued, his tone unhurried. If we ignore the darker parts of human nature, we pretend they don't exist. Stories help us face them, not embrace them. They're not meant to glorify, they're meant to challenge. Silence filled the studio. Even the producers behind the cameras looked uncertain, realizing that Melissa's calculated attacks were backfiring spectacularly. Keanu wasn't just defending himself, he was shifting the entire perspective, making the audience question their own assumptions. Melissa forced another smile, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. I suppose that's one way to look at it, she muttered, trying to laugh it off. But the energy had shifted, and no matter how much she tried to regain control, it was slipping through her fingers like sand. Melissa hesitated, feeling the pressure tighten around her. The audience wasn't reacting the way she'd expected. They weren't rallying behind her clever traps or pointed remarks. Instead, they seemed captivated by Keanu's calm wisdom and effortless grace. She needed to escalate, and fast. She leaned in closer, her tone suddenly more aggressive. But Keanu, she said firmly, don't you think it's problematic that your characters rarely show vulnerability? They're tough, silent, almost invincible. In today's world, isn't that a toxic ideal? Shouldn't men be encouraged to express their emotions rather than bottle them up? Keanu glanced at her, a faint smile forming on his lips. It's not about hiding emotions, he replied gently. It's about choosing how to deal with them. My characters don't suppress their pain. They carry it. They don't lash out. They confront it. Just because someone doesn't break down doesn't mean they're unfeeling. Melissa scoffed lightly, trying to push his buttons. So you're saying it's okay to never show weakness, to always act tough, no matter what? Keanu took a slow breath, his calm demeanor unwavering. Weakness isn't about crying or not crying. It's about giving in to fear instead of pushing through it. Strength isn't pretending pain doesn't exist. It's learning to live with it without letting it destroy you. The audience seemed almost hypnotized by his words, nodding in agreement. Melissa felt a jolt of frustration and quickly glanced at her cue cards, searching for something sharper, something to break through his unshakable calm. But don't you think that's a dangerous mindset? She challenged, encouraging people to bottle up their struggles instead of expressing them openly. Isn't that exactly what society is trying to move away from? Keanu gave a gentle nod, acknowledging her point without agreeing. There's a difference between expressing pain and being consumed by it, he said softly. You can acknowledge your struggles without letting them define you. That's what resilience is, facing hardship without losing your humanity. Melissa clenched her jaw, realizing that every response from him was like water flowing around the rocks she kept throwing his way. She needed to hit him with something more direct, something that would force a reaction. She straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. You know, she said, her voice lowering, some critics say your movies glorify violence and vengeance, especially John Wick. A man on a killing spree because of a personal loss. Doesn't that send a message that violence is justified as long as it's personal? Keanu's eyes darkened just a fraction, but his expression remained calm. John Wick's story isn't about justifying violence, he said quietly. It's about grief. A man who loses everything and feels his soul slipping away. It's not about revenge. It's about trying to find something to hold on to when everything else is gone. Melissa pounced on his words. But isn't that just romanticizing violent retribution? Making it look noble when it's really just brutal? Keanu leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Sometimes stories show us the darkest parts of ourselves, so we can understand them, not celebrate them. If we pretend those feelings don't exist, they'll find other ways to surface. Stories help us confront what we're afraid to admit. The room was completely still. Even Melissa found herself momentarily speechless, caught in the quiet intensity of his words. She hadn't expected him to take such a philosophical stance, and it was throwing her off balance. She gave a tight, forced smile, trying to laugh off the tension. You certainly have a way with words, she remarked, hoping to lighten the mood. But don't you think your movies are still sending a dangerous message, regardless of intention? Keanu's face softened, his expression almost sympathetic. People see what they want to see. If they only focus on the violence, they miss the message behind it, the struggle, the loss, the fight to survive. Sometimes life feels like a battle. Stories just put that struggle into perspective. The audience erupted into applause, catching Melissa completely off guard. She forced another smile, but it was clear that the crowd wasn't on her side. Keanu's responses were so effortlessly profound that it made her attempts at provocation seem petty and shallow. She glanced toward the control room, where producers looked uneasy, whispering among themselves. Melissa knew she was losing the battle, and her carefully planned ambush was backfiring spectacularly, but she wasn't about to give up yet. Melissa took a deep breath, fighting the creeping frustration gnawing at her composure. She couldn't afford to lose control now. The audience was clearly siding with Keanu, and every word out of his mouth felt like a calm, measured truth. She needed to change tactics, make it more personal. She flashed a smile, though it was more forced than before. "You know, Keanu," she began, with a softer, almost pitying tone. "You've built this image of being the nice guy in Hollywood, always humble, always kind. But doesn't that put pressure on you to live up to this perfect persona all the time? Isn't it exhausting pretending to be something you're not?" Keanu looked at her thoughtfully, his expression soft but unwavering. "I don't see it as pressure," he replied. "It's not about living up to an image. It's about being consistent with who I am. Kindness isn't something I put on like a costume. It's just how I choose to live." Melissa's smile tightened, realizing he had just flipped her question on its head again. She needed to push harder. "But doesn't that come across as fake to some people?" she pressed. "No one's that good all the time. Isn't it just a carefully crafted image to keep the public on your side?" Keanu glanced down for a moment, as if choosing his words with care. "People will always have opinions," he said gently. "Some will think it's genuine, others will think it's an act. But I can't live my life trying to prove myself to everyone. I'd rather just be kind, even if some people doubt it." The audience seemed moved by his response, and Melissa could feel her grip on the interview slipping again. She needed something bold, something that would catch him off guard. Taking a risk, she leaned in closer and dropped her voice, making it sound almost confrontational. "But what if it's all just part of your brand? Being the nice guy so people ignore your flaws? Isn't that just manipulating public perception?" Keanu looked at her calmly, and then his lips curved into a small, almost wistful smile. "If being decent is seen as manipulation, maybe that says more about how people perceive kindness than how I choose to act." The room went silent for a moment. Melissa blinked, caught off guard by how effortlessly he turned the statement back on her. She glanced at the audience. Some were nodding in agreement, while others looked thoughtfully at Keanu. The tension was shifting again, and Melissa felt her confidence waver. Desperate to regain control, she switched to a more provocative line of questioning. "You know," she said, almost sneering, "some say your movies are just repetitive violence, nothing more than glorified revenge fantasies. Isn't that sending the wrong message about how to deal with pain and loss?" Keanu's face remained calm, his voice as steady as ever. "Pain and loss are part of life," he said. "Stories about them aren't endorsements. They're reflections. Sometimes we fight back, sometimes we endure, sometimes we lose. But the purpose isn't to glorify, it's to understand." Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but Keanu didn't give her the chance. If stories only showed the perfect way to handle everything, they wouldn't be real. People connect with struggle because it's human. It's not about teaching people to be violent. It's about acknowledging that sometimes we break before we heal. The audience broke into spontaneous applause, and Melissa's forced smile faltered. She glanced back at the control room where the producers were whispering frantically, clearly sensing the shift. She couldn't let him take over like this. She had to steer the conversation back into her control. Grasping at straws, she decided to make it even more personal. "Okay, Keanu," she said, forcing a chuckle. "Let's cut to the chase. Do you really believe that your style of acting and your traditional values still have a place in modern Hollywood? Maybe it's time to move aside for the next generation." Keanu looked at her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful but unwavering. Then he smiled softly. "Respecting the next generation doesn't mean discarding the old one. Stories evolve, yes, but values like loyalty, courage, and kindness, they don't become outdated just because times change. Maybe the challenge is to blend the old and the new, not choose one over the other." Melissa couldn't help the irritation that flashed across her face. She had walked right into that one, and she knew it. The audience was clearly on Keanu's side now, and the producers looked increasingly uncomfortable. Keanu's calm, respectful responses were making her look desperate and confrontational. She tried to force another smile, but the cracks were beginning to show. "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective," she said, trying to sound unbothered. But the damage was done, and everyone in the room could feel it. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. Melissa could feel it, and so could the audience. The producers were nervously whispering behind the cameras, their plan unraveling right before their eyes. Melissa had intended to expose Keanu as outdated and irrelevant, but instead, he had turned every question into a lesson about resilience and integrity. Desperate to salvage the interview, Melissa decided to go for the most personal angle yet, something that would force a reaction. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "You know, Keanu," she said softly, "people always talk about how kind and grounded you are, but isn't that just a coping mechanism? You've faced a lot of loss. Your girlfriend, your daughter, even your best friend. Isn't it easier to put on this nice guy act than to actually confront your own grief?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The audience looked shocked, and even the producers froze, not expecting such a brutal, invasive question. Keanu didn't react immediately. He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were calm, but filled with a quiet, unspoken pain. "Loss is complicated," he said gently. "It never leaves you. You just learn to live with it. Being kind doesn't mean ignoring grief. It means choosing not to let it make you bitter. I can't change what happened, but I can choose how I respond to it." Melissa was caught off guard, expecting him to either shut down or lash out. Instead, his honesty disarmed her completely. The audience remained silent, captivated by the rawness in his words. She stammered, trying to regain control. "But don't you think people deserve to see the real you, the one who's not always so perfect?" Keanu gave a faint smile, almost as if he felt sorry for her attempts to break him down. "Nobody's perfect, Shoaib, perfect," he replied. "We all have scars, whether they show or not, but kindness isn't about being flawless. It's about choosing to rise above pain and treat others with compassion despite it. I don't do it to seem good. I do it because that's how I want to live." The audience erupted into applause, and Melissa couldn't hide her frustration anymore. She tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced and hollow. Keanu just sat there, calm and composed, letting the energy settle. Before she could ask another question, one of the producers signaled to cut to a commercial break, sensing that the interview had spiraled out of Melissa's control. As the cameras faded to black, Melissa leaned back in her seat, clearly rattled. Keanu simply gave her a polite nod and waited for the chaos to subside. Backstage, the producers were already in damage control mode, whispering frantically about how to edit the footage to make Melissa look less hostile. But it was too late. The audience's reaction had already made it clear who had won. When the interview resumed, Melissa plastered on a fake smile and tried to wrap things up smoothly. "Well, that was certainly an enlightening conversation," she said, trying to sound upbeat. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Keanu." Keanu gave a gentle nod. "Thanks for having me," he replied calmly. As the show ended, people in the audience pulled out their phones, already buzzing with excitement over what they had just witnessed. Clips from the interview started spreading like wildfire on social media. Keanu's calm, insightful responses contrasted sharply against Melissa's increasingly desperate attempts to provoke him. By the time Keanu stepped out of the studio and onto his motorcycle, his phone was already lighting up with messages from friends and fans praising his composure and integrity. He glanced at the notifications, gave a faint smile, and rode off into the fading sunlight. Meanwhile, Melissa sat in her dressing room, staring blankly at her reflection. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. News outlets were already picking up on the backlash. Keanu didn't flinch and hashtag gentleness. Wins were trending worldwide, while countless comments mocked her for trying to tear down a man who had done nothing but remain calm and respectful. Sponsors began pulling out, and the network called an emergency meeting to discuss the fallout. Melissa knew it was over. Her reputation had been shredded in real time, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. Keanu hadn't just survived the ambush, he had turned it into a masterclass on how to confront aggression with grace. As for Keanu, he didn't bother giving statements or addressing the controversy. He simply went on with his life, quietly reminding the world that true power doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from staying true to your values, no matter how much someone tries to break you.